you ask the question, when does the fetus have a right to use the woman's body? What a strange way to describe pregnancy. One person using another's body. If that is what pregnancy is, then every pregnancy violates the categorical imperative, because we should not use other persons. I also don't see how you get away with not defending infanticide, because nursing is also necessary for life. The only difference is that you can have somebody else do the nursing, but somebody has to nurse that baby. That baby, even when it's born, is dependent upon some mothers, some women, otherwise it will die. Although I don't want to press that too much, because I remember an argument that I once lost with some very intelligent feminists. I argued that there was no argument that justified abortion that didn't also justify infanticide, and they concluded, you convinced us, you persuaded us, we didn't think we could change our minds, but we have. I said, oh, you're pro-life now? No, they said, we're pro-infanticide. The compensation element here, I agree that in the case of rape, there needs to be compensation, and since the rapist can't make it, society must make it somehow. But in the case of a pregnancy that's not due to rape, it seems to be, again, an unnatural parallel, because the fetus is not guilty like a rapist. The fetus is not a willing perpetrator of harm against the woman. And to compare this with walking in the park where you don't want to be mugged, but you know you might be, is like comparing a man that a woman supposedly loves with a mugger. That's very strange. Throughout the argument, pregnancy is treated as something like mugging, or something like kidnapping, or something like a disease. But suppose we treat pregnancy as most societies throughout the history of the world and all cultures have treated it, namely as something that's more like a power, a privilege. Suppose that is its nature, whatever our attitude towards it is. If I kiss you, or if I give you a gift, or if I give you a compliment, you can indeed be hurt by that, but you shouldn't, because it's a gift, it's not a threat. On the other hand, if I slap you in the face, you could thank me for it, if you're something of a masochist, but by its nature, it's meant to harm. Two things. First, a very specific logical question, which can be answered very quickly. When is it right to kill a baby? You admit that once the baby's born, its right to life trumps even the mother's convenience. She can put it up for adoption. You don't justify infanticide. All right. If infanticide is wrong and abortion is not, then at what point does killing the baby become wrong? When the umbilical cord is cut, so that it's the doctor's scissors that gives the baby the right to live? Or is it more and more wrong to kill a baby as the pregnancy wears on? Not because the baby is bigger or approximates what we are more, but because the baby is getting closer and closer to independence. But that too is a matter of degree. How can, whether it's right to kill a person with a right to life or not, depend upon something that's a matter of degree? That's my first question. But my deeper question involves some deeper philosophical principles here. And I think I now understand what divides us on foundational grounds. My fundamental challenge was, these examples of yours are all unnatural. And your fundamental answer was, okay, that's not so bad, because I wasn't arguing by a kind of a direct analogy. I was arguing in order to prove a general principle. So however artificial these examples are, if your agreement with these examples logically entails your agreement with a general principle, and then if in turn that general principle can be used to justify abortion, then logically you have granted the right to abortion. I think you're confusing induction with abstraction here. I think these unnatural examples do not convince us of the general principle, and that my natural examples do, because the natural examples can be understood to be relevant, whereas the unnatural examples can't. The difference between induction and abstraction is that induction is a purely logical procedure which a computer can do, whereas abstraction is a specifically human act of understanding. You can abstract human nature from human beings, or the nature of grapefruits from grapefruits, or the nature of triangles from different kinds of triangles, but that's an immediate first act of the mind act, which computers can't do. A second connected difference is, I think, the relation between reason and emotion. These natural cases do elicit from us an immediate instinctive emotional response, which the artificial ones don't, and therefore the artificial ones are better from your point of view. I think they're worse from my point of view. I don't see emotions as irrational. I find emotions revelatory. We have emotions about things. To use an example I gave a moment ago, if you slap me in the face and I smile and say thank you, that's an emotion, but it's revelatory of something. It's revelatory that I'm a masochist. I don't see emotions as being the enemies of reason. Unless emotion and reason function together, Nietzsche showed this very powerfully, you don't have great art. You don't have love. You don't have religion. In all the most important human areas, we don't separate these two things. There are times when we do want to separate them, especially in science. If the laboratory worker is in love with his guinea pigs, he's not going to cut them up. But I don't think we should treat women as guinea pigs and cut up their our emotional response versus our rational response in that way. We can distinguish them, but I think we have to bring in our emotional response as very important and relevant data. And therefore, I would not want to do ethics in a purely deductive way or a purely inductive way. Let me give you an example of that. A ethical dilemma that students always ask about is lying, because the ethics of lying, I think, is a little more tricky than the ethics of most commandments. Most of us think that lying is bad inherently. Kant wrote his great classic Metaphysics of Morals precisely to deal with the question of, is it ever right to lie? And he argued that it isn't, because of his categorical imperative. And the classic case is, if you're a Dutchman hiding Jews from the Nazis, do you lie to them when they come to your door? Now, the two classical answers to that are yes and no. But if you say yes, that means lying isn't always wrong. If you say no, you say it's because lying is always wrong. I don't start there. I start with saying, obviously we all know that it's not right to tell them. We don't know why. We don't know whether it's an inductive or a deductive argument, but obviously you don't tell the Nazis. You deceive them. You deliberately deceive them. Now, do you do that because sometimes it's right to lie, or do you do that because this is not a lie? Or do you do that because they've given up their right to the truth? I don't much care. I just know that you don't do that. And I think we instinctively know the same thing about abortion, that it's wrong for a mother to kill her baby. I'm glad you asked that question, because that reveals, I think, maybe more clear than anything I said a moment ago, the deeper philosophical divide between us. There's two things you might mean by natural. You might mean something that is empirically or statistically ordinary or normal. Or you might mean something teleological, something that inherently helps rather than harms, or conduces to the perfecting or the flourishing or the happiness of the thing you're talking about. And I think you mean the first thing by natural, and I mean the second thing by natural. You say then that rape and promiscuity are natural because they're ordinary, they occur. I would say they're both unnatural. I don't think we do, in fact, and we certainly ought not, to judge whether a thing is morally right or not by a purely empirical test. That's confusing facts with values. If all the men in the world were much more strongly inclined to rape women than they are, and if they all did it all the time, and if they all justified it, that would not make it one bit more right, because it harms the very nature of a woman, part of which is her free consent. So my notion of natural is a very old-fashioned one. It's a basically Aristotelian, teleological, commonsensical notion of natural. I think the deeper divide between us then is that I'm pre-Cartesian and you're post-Cartesian. You're thinking either in a purely logical, deductive way or in a purely empirical way. And I'm trying to transcend that divide by looking at the naturalness of the act. There are three essential premises to the pro-life argument, and therefore three possible pro-choice rebuttals depending on which of these three premises is denied. To be pro-choice, you must deny at least one of them because taken together they logically entail the pro-life conclusion. But there are three very significantly different pro-choice positions depending on which of these three pro-life premises is targeted. And frankly, I'm not quite sure which move my opponent would make here. So let me set out the case. The first premise is a scientific premise. The second is a moral premise, and the third is a legal premise. The scientific premise is that the life of the individual member of every animal species, and therefore also of the human species, begins at conception, when a genetically new and genetically complete individual first comes into existence. This truism was taught in all biology textbooks in America that were written before abortion was legalized in 1972, but not by most of the books that were written after 1972. Yet the new textbooks did not appeal to a single new scientific discovery to justify their change. So the first premise of the pro-life argument is that all humans are human. Whether they're dying humans or old humans or mature humans or inconvenient humans or young humans or infantile humans or teenage humans or fetal humans or even embryonic humans. The fetus is not another species, it's a fetal human. Second, the moral premise is that all humans have the right to life because all humans are human. All humans have human nature, have the human essence, and therefore are essentially equal. The universal right to life is a deduction from the most obvious of moral rules, the golden rule, or justice, or equality, or the categorical imperative. Since you do not want others to kill you against your will, you ought not to kill them against their will. It's just not fair, not just. Finally, the legal premise is that the law must protect the most basic human rights. If all humans are human, and if all humans have a right to life, and if the law must protect human rights, then the law must protect the right of all humans to life. The one exception would be a non-innocent human who threatens the life of another human. If all three premises are true, the pro-life conclusion follows. So from the pro-life point of view, there are only three reasons anyone can be pro-choice, either scientific ignorance, or moral ignorance, or legal ignorance. In fact, appalling scientific ignorance, ignorance of a scientific fact so basic that nearly everyone knows it, or appalling moral ignorance, ignorance of the most basic of all moral laws, or appalling legal ignorance, ignorance of one of the most basic of all the functions of the law. Though the three kinds of ignorance are all appalling, they're not all equally appalling. Scientific ignorance, if honest, is really ignorance rather than ignoring. It's honest. It's pitiable, but not always morally blameworthy. You don't have to be wicked to be ignorant. If it is possible to believe sincerely that an unborn baby is only a group of cells or potential life, then it's possible to believe sincerely that you are not killing a human being when you have an abortion. Of course, the question remains, what is it then? If it's only a potential life, is it the undead? If it's only a potential human, is it an ape? And if you don't believe you're killing a human being when you have an abortion, why then do most mothers who abort have such terrible dreams? And why do over 70% of them deeply regret it when they're older, according to the polls? Most pro-choice arguments during the first couple of decades after Roe v. Wade was passed disputed the scientific premise. Maybe this was sometimes dishonest, maybe it was honest. I can't judge that. But most pro-choice arguments today increasingly deny the moral premise. And I think that's my opponent's strategy. I'm not sure what the reason for the strategy is. Maybe pro-choicers now perceive that they have no choice here because scientific facts are not deniable, not negotiable, as moral principles seem to be. Whatever the reason, I think this is a vast sea change, because if this moral camel has gotten not just his nose under the tent, but his torso too, I think we are in trouble. If one denies this basic moral premise, then I have a very good Hobbesian reason for being pro-life, and that's self-interest. You know the famous statement, I think it's Dietrich Bonhoeffer, they came for the Jews and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the gypsies and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a gypsy. Then they came for the communists and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then, when they came for me, there was no one to speak up for me. Dostoevsky wrote, "We are each responsible for all." John Donne said, "No man is an island. Never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." I think I detect a lot of Hobbesian individualism in my opponent's philosophy, as distinct from any kind of communitarianism that could produce a real community. I think the camel's nose is under the tent, and it's a one-piece camel, and I will label this camel the culture of death. I don't see any argument that would justify abortion that would not also justify infanticide, active euthanasia, suicide, eugenics, genetic engineering, cloning, and harvesting fetal body parts in what Jeremy Rifkin calls the human body shop. Or even, finally, the replacement of defective or imperfect natural human beings with perfect genetically engineered artificial human beings, a la Brave New World. This would be, in C.S. Lewis's words, the abolition of man. So I think down the line, your and my survival is at stake. Remember, it's a one-piece camel. That argument is very simple, and the usual strategy of avoiding it is to say it is not simple. It is a complex issue. The argument is usually from skepticism. Most pro-choicers think that pro-lifers claim to know too much. They're too dogmatic. How dare they pontificate with such certainty and imply that all who disagree are either mentally or morally or legally challenged. So I will give an argument for the skeptic, who would not even agree with the very first principles that we know what a human being is, or what human rights are. It's fashionable to appeal to this kind of skepticism to justify being pro-choice. Since we do not know with certainty when human life begins, the U.S. Supreme Court argued in Roe v. Wade, therefore we should not impose restrictions. Well, the simple answer to this argument is to demand a reason why it's more restrictive to give life than to take it. Why allowing abortion doesn't impose a more severe and violent restriction on its victim than forbidding abortion does. And the only reasonable answer is that this is so because we know that the human fetus is not a person with rights. But my opponent admitted that it is. Let me put this last argument from skepticism in a purely logical form. Let's assume not a dogmatic skepticism, which is self-contradictory, but a skeptical skepticism. Let's be skeptical even about skepticism. Let's assume that we don't know whether a fetus is a person or not. We don't know whether we can know that or not. What then can we know? Well, by formal logic alone, we can know two things. First, we know that either the fetus is or it is not a human person with a right to life, just as we know that either it's a Martian or not. It's either hairless or not, and so on. We may not know which it is, but we know that everything must be either X or non-X. And the second thing that we know is that either we do or do not know what it is. So there are only four possibilities. Either the fetus is or is not a human person, and either the person who justifies abortion knows or does not know what the fetus is. So the four logical possibilities are that the fetus is a human person and we know it, that it is a human person and we don't know it, that it's not a human person and we don't know it, and that it's not a human person and we do know that fact. Now, what is abortion in each case? In case number one, where the fetus is a human person and you know that, abortion is murder. It is the deliberate killing of what you know to be an innocent human person. That's a simple and strong and massive argument. No amount of pro-choice protest about how the word murder hurts them and imperils civil discussion can change the fact. In case number two, where the fetus is a human person, but you don't know that, abortion is manslaughter. It is like driving over an overcoat in the street at night that's shaped like a man, and you don't know whether there's a man under it or not. It's like shooting into a bush that may contain a deer or your fellow hunter. It's like fumigating a building with toxic chemicals without being certain that the building is fully evacuated. You don't know there's a person there, but you don't know that there isn't. And it just so happens there is a person there, and you kill that person. You can't plead ignorance. True, you didn't know there was a person there, so you didn't intend deliberate murder. But you didn't know there wasn't either, so your act was literally the height of irresponsibility. In case number three, where the fetus is not a person, but you don't know that, abortion is just as irresponsible as in case number two. You deliberately ran over the overcoat, shot into the bush, or fumigated the building without knowing that there were no persons there. You were lucky. There weren't. But you didn't know that, and you didn't care. You're just as irresponsible. You can't legally be charged with murder or even with manslaughter because no man was slaughtered. But you can and should be charged with criminal negligence. Only in case number four, where the fetus is not a person and you know that, is abortion morally reasonable, responsible, and permissible. But note carefully that what makes case number four permissible is not merely the fact that the fetus is not a person with full human rights, but also your knowledge of that fact, your overcoming of skepticism. So skepticism cannot count for abortion, but only against it. Only if you are not a skeptic can abortion be moral. Only if you are certain that there's no person in the overcoat or the bush or the building or the womb may you morally drive or shoot or fumigate or abort. So I think that undercuts even the weakest escape, namely to pretend you don't know what abortion is, you don't know what a fetus is, you don't know what a human being is. I compliment my opponent for the logic of his arguments and the clarity of his arguments, and rather than try to give a purely logical response, I would conclude with two things, one a question and one a confession. The question is, do you really think that your arguments would significantly help a woman to overcome the guilt that she usually feels after she has an abortion? If not, is this simply because she's emotional rather than rational? And the confession is why I'm pro-life. That is a motive rather than a reason. I think motives are things that move us often more than reasons. There's two reasons that I'm pro-life. One is because I want to be ethical, and the other is because I want to be religious. And the two come together. It seems to me abortion is simply unjust, unethical, unfair. It seems to me that it is not a complex issue at all. If it's not wrong for big, strong people to kill little, weak people just because they don't want them to live, then what could possibly be wrong? What could the word wrong possibly mean then? Only perhaps that the only thing that's wrong is using the word wrong. If there's any one moral rule that any morally sane person must admit, it's this one: love people, all people, respect people, treat people as ends, not means. Don't use them. Persons are ends, not means. Killing them certainly does not treat them as ends. It treats them as cockroaches. It's not amazing that many of the same people who deplore capital punishment against convicted murderers promote capital punishment against innocent babies. I meant to say that is amazing. Apparently, in this ethical system, the crime of a baby being in a mother's way is deserving of death, but the crime of getting another adult out of your way by killing him is not. And secondly, I will confess that abortion is indeed, for most pro-lifers, a religious issue, but not in the way that our critics say. It's not just a Catholic issue or just a Christian issue. It's a war between all religions and none. Because all the religions of the world, organized or disorganized, and I never met an organized religion in my life, they all strike me as rather like Noah's Ark, all the religions of the world see human life as a sacred mystery. Opposition to abortion then is instinctively religious but not sectarian. The idea that life is sacred is by definition a religious idea, but it doesn't belong to any one religion. It belongs to the human race. And its enemy is that tiny, powerful army of the arrogant who scorn the deepest convictions of 99 out of every 100 humans who have ever walked the earth as some old, silly, superstitious fallacy or fantasy or folly or fear. And if from our consciousness is abolished the very sense of the sacred, then from our consciousness can easily be abolished the sense of the sacredness of lives. And once the sense of the sacredness of lives can be abolished, those lives can be abolished. So the fight for the sanctity of life is literally a holy war. It's a war for holiness itself. Here is my most non-negotiable reason for fighting for the pro-life cause, and the reason why pro-lifers will never, never, never give up. Why we can never give up. Why we have no choice. We are not pro-choice. Here we stand. We cannot do otherwise. God help us. It's because the face that confronts us in some way, however inchoate and unconscious, is not just the tiny innocent face of a human baby or the face of the woman, but the enormous, totally innocent face of God, who has designed and created us and the woman and the baby. It is that image that abortion kills. Abortion is homicide, and homicide is deicide because man is God's image, God's child. Abortion's victim is one of God's kids, and if you kill any good father's kids, you're far more his enemy than if you kill him. Do you think God is any less loyal to his kids than we are? People often ask where God was in the Holocaust. My answer is that he was gassed. We all know that we will die, and we all instinctively know that when we die, we will stop avoiding truth, because we will find truth unavoidable. And if we believe in God, we know why. We will stand before the truth. And the truth will say to us something like this: I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. I was in the womb, the place of holy life, and you slaughtered me. And we will ask, Lord, when did we do this? And he will answer, truly, truly, I tell you, whenever you did this to one of the least of my brethren, you did it to me.